All right, Salaam alaikum, peace be upon you all, and welcome to another Finding Truth podcast. And I'm really happy and excited today to have with me Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. And the reason is his CV and his experience and research in many fields that we have been addressing on this channel. So let me first introduce him to you. First of all, Josh, how are you doing today?
I'm so wonderful. Yeah, thank you for having me with you. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Joshua Rasmussen is an associate professor of philosophy. His area of expertise is analytic metaphysics with a focus on basic categories of reality, such as objects, ideas, and necessary existence. He is author of several books, including Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth by Cambridge University Press. Second one is Necessary Existence with Pruss by Oxford University Press. How Reason Can Lead to God. Is God the Best Explanation of Things with Felipe Leon. And he is also the founder of the Worldview Design YouTube channel, which helps people use reason to address the big questions of life. And Josh, I believe you are also now in the process of writing a very interesting book. Maybe we can start by telling us what the book is about, because I think we will be primarily going around this book in our interesting topic of today of AI and consciousness. So,
Yeah, thank you. I've been
what
thinking a
about?
lot about
Yeah.
consciousness. That's what the topic of this book is. The working title
Mhm.
is Who Are You Really? And if you think of yourself as kind of an organizer of consciousness, something that has consciousness in a very specific kind of way. Now I want to understand, well, what is that? And let me just say, part of the reason I got interested in this is because I've been curious about sort of the natures of things, like the fundamental nature of existence. And consciousness is kind of like a window into reality. I mean, when you look at your own consciousness, you're seeing thoughts, feelings. I guess you're not seeing them with your eyes, but in a way you're detecting their realities right within you. And these realities are telling you something about reality. Reality somehow is able to give rise to thinking and to feeling. And so that's why I got interested in this topic. And yeah, I've been working on it kind of every day, just researching, trying to go deeper and deeper. It's been a lot of fun.
Great. So, for everybody, today we will be discussing the very interesting topic of artificial intelligence and consciousness. So, Josh, first of all, every now and then in the news these days, and probably within the last few decades, somebody will put onto the news or into a show a robot and tell us that this robot is, the last thing that was shown on the news was this robot that had facial expressions. They had it tied to the ground so it cannot move, maybe to pacify people. And prior to that, there was that other robot that was, going around the world and
I've
having
seen that.
interviews, etc. Without mentioning the names of the robots. But at the end of the day, um, there's this big question. Even those movies with the Skynet and the singularity
Yeah.
and the internet waking up one day and crying and acting like a human being and starting to gain consciousness. So the first thing, that's our the tip of the thread. Can The question today is, can a machine think and not just think like compute, but be aware of itself?
Yeah.
um, how can we really answer this question, putting together philosophy, theology, and science? Of course, you are in the philosophy part. It
Yeah.
happens that I'm also an electronics and a communication engineer with a career in compute and information systems. So I think we can have some ideas together about this. But
Yeah.
let's start somewhere. Do you think a machine can actually think to the extent it is self-aware
Yeah.
or not? Yeah.
Well, the question points to a deep puzzle because on some level, I was telling you this before the show, that in some level, I would take myself to be a certain kind of machine. In the
Hmm.
sense that I can receive inputs through experiences in my eyes, and then this can lead to certain outputs and activities. In a way, I sort of simulate certain kinds of functions. So, as a machine would function, I function. And yet, here I am thinking and not just acting like I'm thinking. I mean, I testify to you that I actually am aware of my thoughts. It's a conscious experience that I'm having. So if that's right, then here I am, a machine that thinks, which then would verify that somehow machines can think, at least some kind of machine can think, the kind of machine that I am, whatever I am. But then that leads to the puzzle, which is, well, what kind of a machine? Like, what kind of materials does it take for there to be actual conscious thinking? And part of the problem, and part of the reason this is a puzzle, I mean, there's a lot of different reasons that I think can become clear as you zoom into the nature of consciousness. But sort of from a bird's eye perspective, I think all of us understand intuitively the difference between merely acting as if you're thinking, functioning as if you're actually conscious. You mentioned these robots. We designed these robots to have a face. We put shapes here. There's certain inputs, and we can cause the lips to sort of curl upward, and that's supposed to sort of signify maybe happiness, right? But is the robot actually feeling happiness from the inside? Well, we understand intuitively that merely having the shape of a happy expression doesn't thereby explain or predict or make the machine have that inner feeling. So then that does lead to that question. Well, what does it take to make something have that inner feeling?
At a very basic level, if a little kid, a little boy or a little girl draws a smiley face on a piece of paper, it doesn't really mean that the piece of paper is happy, does it?
It doesn't thereby automatically make the paper happy, right? Or maybe you color it blue and now you've made the whole paper feel sad, right? And I think, you laugh because I think intuitively you recognize the absurdity that merely changing the color or a paint stroke on a piece of paper would make it have feelings. Intuitively, we see that doesn't seem to be enough. And yet, I mean, people watching this might be saying, well, but what you need is a certain kind of sophisticated brain, right? Because after all, brains are associated with the kinds of beings that we are, beings who can think and feel.
Absolutely.
And so somebody might be watching this and say, it might be saying, well, somehow we may not know how consciousness can be, but somehow we know that there is consciousness. But that actually doesn't solve the problem. I mean, that just is the question. Like, what does it take for there to be consciousness? Like, what is it about organizing things into a brain that makes the difference, that sort of sparks the feelings and the thoughts? And that's the kind of puzzle that I think leads scientists and philosophers into the depths of reality.
I'd like to spice that up a little bit here, because now from the naturalist point of view, from the Darwinist point of view, from the methodological naturalist point of view, a human being is a machine who is made up of those little small parts, little molecular machines on molecular biology and cellular level.
Yeah.
And then I think because this is the naturalist view, then he's saying, since he believes in nothing else in a human being or any animal or any living thing other than a very sophisticated machine, then the compelling question to him is, can we just put some other parts on another machine that we make? And since we are nothing but matter, then we will eventually be able to crack it, and we will create another machine that is just as conscious as us. And I think the question that we are trying to answer today is a very philosophical question that might as well lead us to, are we just machines, or there is some other layer of reality there that's making us who we are, and making animals who they are, and making living cells who they are? So do you agree that these questions are actually connected?
Yes, absolutely.
Philosophically.
Yes. And I mean, I would want to distinguish between varieties of versions of naturalism. So what you're describing here, in the way that I hear you describing this version of naturalism, you might call it a kind of reductive naturalism. It sort of reduces all the elements of thinking and feeling to elements that we understand in fundamental physics. So if you have some particles and we understand all the properties of those particles, we could see how through a certain arrangement of those particles, there could be thinking and feeling. That would be kind of a reductive naturalism. But there are other versions of naturalism that allow for there to be the kinds of beings that we sort of take ourselves to be without reducing the qualitative aspects of consciousness purely in terms of fundamental physics. And so this does point to the connection that you're talking about, because what I love about what you're saying is that even if there's some sense in which I am a machine, my consciousness is not merely in virtue of me being a machine, if this makes sense. So, and here I have some conviction on this point, that merely functioning as if it looks like I'm thinking and feeling, functioning as a machine, is not all by itself going to be enough to give me that spark of first-person experience. And by the way, this is sort of a common insight among the philosophers who work in the field. They talk about what's called multiple realizability. This is the idea that you could have feelings that are realized or instantiated or come into, for lack of better words, different kinds of physical systems. So you could have, for example, dogs and cats both having certain feelings of pain, and their systems may be different. In principle, you might even be able to swap out the carbon atoms for like silicon atoms, maybe. As long as they're functioning in a certain way, then those creatures can have the qualitative aspect of feeling pain. But my argument is that the function all by itself is not going to be the whole story. There's got to be the right kind of thing, the right kind of substance in which there can be consciousness, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of different concepts here that I think have to be clarified in order to understand even what's at stake.
So let's first, it leads us to the first question, or the second question here, since we are going to think of whether machines can have consciousness and whether us as humans have something other than being a machine involved that leads to consciousness, then the first question that lends itself would be, what is consciousness and what is self-awareness? When I say I'm conscious, I'm aware of myself, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that is actually hard to define in terms of other things, because it's one of those things I think you sort of recognize by being a conscious being. So the way that I think about it is, I find myself thinking of something. So right now I'm thinking that 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, I'm not lying. I actually just literally had that thought in my mind, and I'm paying attention to that thought in my mind. And this experience of the thought is an example of consciousness. It's some sort of item of experience. Anything that you can be sort of conscious of or experiencing is what I would think of as an element of consciousness.
So to be conscious of one's self, because, for example, let's consider a computer, and this computer has a camera, and this camera is pointing at me, just like we are actually in this exact setting today. So my computer has a camera, this camera is projecting my image, and your computer has a camera and is projecting your image. How is that different? What is the difference between my computer seeing me and you seeing me? And I seeing you versus your computer seeing you. I hope this can be a good example to start with. What's different? What's the difference? What makes your computer not conscious, but I am conscious of you?
Yeah, well, that is a question that leads to this notion of self-awareness, right? I mean, it seems like I have this ability to turn my consciousness on myself and be aware of myself. And in this self-awareness, I'm actually experiencing what you might call a first-person perspective, a perspective from a point of view. I was actually just working on my chapter on the nature of the self today. And in that chapter, I talk about how you provide a very key element in your own experience of a perspective. So like everybody watching this has a perspective sitting there, watching the screen. And it's like, well, what is a perspective? What is a perspective from a first person vantage point? It's like, well, whatever it is, it seems to involve you. You have a perspective. I have a perspective. And that seems to point to at least one kind of difference between at least a purely third person description of machines. So if you just think of a machine purely in terms of, let's say, its geometric and functional aspects, those geometric and functional aspects aren't including that perspective on reality, because you can describe it in a purely third person perspectiveless way. You can just describe its shape. I brought a few little things to sort of illustrate, these are geometric objects. Okay. These are maybe parts of a potential machine. And the idea is that, like, this object here, it doesn't have a unified perspective. It doesn't have that awareness. Neither does this object. Okay, presumably. Well, let's assume for sake of argument, right? Because maybe we could even question that, right? But if these things don't have a perspective, then the question is, could merely putting these perspectiveless things together in some combination result in something that has a first-person perspective? Is that even possible?
They would suddenly just, if you put so many wooden cubes together or wooden cylinders together, suddenly they will realize, hey, we are wooden cylinders.
We are real. Yes. Well, and which is the thing that has the perspective? Because this leads to what's called the subject problem. What's the subject of perspective? Is it this thing? Is it this thing? Is it them together? Is it these two things? Is it these three? Think about your own body losing atoms and getting new atoms. Is it that the subject changes? So like when you have these three as your parts and then one goes away, now you have these two. These are the subject. Or is there this other thing in addition to the parts that is the subject? And this leads us to the sort of deep, deep questions. But I think this does point to one interesting difference between a mere geometrically describable machine or device that's fundamentally characterized in terms of third-person properties versus this kind of first-person reality, this reality that views things from a first-person perspective. And I think that's also a kind of a way of sharpening the puzzle. It's like the puzzle is, what does it take for a machine? If I'm a machine, what does it take for there to be a being like me to have a perspective on the world? And so far, it seems to me that one can make a case that merely having machine-like functionality is not enough to explain that first-person unified conscious experience.
Let me ask you the question this way. What you have demonstrated now in a very simple and a very smart way, actually, is that since you can put all the three blocks and remove any of them, and the thing will not be different, and that can be compared to me. If a human being loses a hand or a limb or an ear or something, he remains himself. So if none of the parts, and even not all of the parts, because you're saying I'm eating new food, I'm excreting all of my life, I'm changing the whole of my body, and you're changing the whole of my body. The body that you have today is completely different than your body as a baby, but you're still Josh and I'm still Ahmed. So if none of the parts represent the self, what is the self if it's not the parts at all?
Yeah, it's such a tricky question. I mean, to even illustrate the question, imagine these are the parts of your body and these are the parts of my body, right? And then let's just say, these are the smallest atomic parts. Now, presumably you continue to be existing even if you clip your fingernails. You can lose some atomic parts. So let's say that one of your atomic parts goes into my body and one of mine goes into your body. Okay. Yeah. And then slowly over time, let's say 7 years, all of your atoms slowly one by one get swapped. So now you have I've got the atoms that you had, let's say 7 years ago, and you've got the atoms that I have had 7 years ago. But am I still me over here? Or am I my atoms? In which case, then I've just switched over to you. And this leads to some interesting puzzles of identity. I do talk about this in my book under the identity problem of, like, what is the thing that is you, that maintains your identity? And it's so interesting just thinking about this analytically. Empirical science will help us get data, but then we have to interpret that data. We have to analyze the data. And that's where deep, careful analytical thinking can give us, I think, some very surprising results. This has been my experience, just slowing down the question of which thing am I? How can I persist through the swapping of parts? And if we have some time, I could talk about some of the main solutions and then some of the main disadvantages with each of the solutions. Would you like me to run through that?
Yeah, actually, let me first ask you this. Because back to the machine. Let's say that given what you're saying, that shapes and parts and colors since they alone can add to just themselves again, and they will not suddenly wake up to being a bigger whole or something. The question here is, all what we have in our brains are essentially shapes and arrangements of molecules and atoms and electrons and signals that are essentially, at the end of the day, elementary particles or packets of energy.
Yes, yes.
So given this example that you've given, any arrangement of parts, whatever the parts are, whether energy packets or material parts, will not really give rise to this first-person experience, but from your very simple thought experiment. But when somebody's talking to a naturalist who is a reductionist also, he will say, how do you know? Maybe if it's biological, maybe if it's carbon-based, maybe if it has water some way or the other. Maybe it's the chemistry plus the biochemistry. Maybe it's because we cannot access biochemistry yet. There is this question of, is this consciousness of the gaps? kind of.
Yeah.
How can we respond to that?
Yeah. No, I think that this question actually kind of points to this, what I call the materials problem or the materials question, which is that you need this sort of right kind of material or subject or something or substance. It's hard to know what language to use. I mean, even I like the word substance, but then in the popular sphere, I was looking up the word substance, and the first 9 definitions of substance were not what philosophers of mind mean by the word substance. They added concepts to it. But what I'm trying to point to is a subject or a something that can have thoughts and feelings. So the idea is that, like, not just anything can have thoughts and feelings. And this isn't just a consciousness of the gaps problem. It's not just what we don't know. There's actually some things that we can know. Now, I don't want to overstate this, but I want to just highlight a few examples to illustrate this. It's that, like, when I think about, let's say, the number 5, I think that through insight into the number 5, I can see that the number 5 cannot itself be a thinker. The number 5 is not the right kind of thing. It's not the right kind of substance or subject to be itself a thinker. Another example, a visual image in my mind. Okay. I think that a visual image is not the right kind of thing to itself be a thinker. Okay. Thoughts themselves can't be thinkers. Like, I can be a thinker, but my thoughts aren't thinkers. And again, this isn't just that I don't know how an image could be a thinker. It's that I actually think that through insight into the nature of an image by direct awareness with my own images, and insight into the nature of thoughts, and insight into myself as a thinker, I can actually see that images aren't the right kind of thing to be a thinker. Now, how does this relate to sort of geometric material structures? Well, it's interesting because the paradigm example of geometric material structures that we experience directly are in the contents of our own visual imagery. So, like, for example, while you're having a dream, you could have a visual image of a geometrically shaped mountain. Now, it's not that there's really actually a mountain there, but it's that you're in having acquaintance in your experience with a kind of geometric structure. And I think that just as you can see, and I don't want to be overconfident or triumphal in my claim here, but I can just report how it looks to me, is that when I concentrate on the natures of geometric structures, it seems to me that just as I can see that an image is the wrong kind of thing to have thoughts and feelings, I think that a geometric structure all on its own, just in virtue of its structure, is the wrong kind of thing to have thoughts and feelings and a first-person perspective all on its own. And so what this does is, I don't think it thereby breaks the naturalist, a kind of non-reductive naturalism, or every version of naturalism, but I think it does inspire us to look deeper into the nature of fundamental reality, into the nature of reality, to see, okay, well, what kind of material, what kind of subject or substance could be a kind of material that could have thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And so, so I think that's where we can actually make progress on this question. But it's not just that we don't see how it could be. I think that you can actually see that certain kinds of things are the wrong kind of things to do that.
So where do you want to go from here? Would you like to go into trying to answer this question?
We could do that. Maybe it would be helpful if I just pointed briefly at some common solutions to what I was calling the identity problem. So part of the thing here is that part of the challenge here is that the philosophy of mind, the sort of consciousness studies, deals with so many different parts. And so there's so many different things, and it takes sort of time to look at these things carefully to have an understanding that doesn't just sort of blur everything together. And so I realize we're covering a lot of ground here, but just to point briefly at this kind of identity problem, which was the problem of kind of which thing is you? What is the subject of your consciousness, especially if you can switch your parts out and still be you? So three kind of standard views on this. So one is the body view. This is the view that the thing that is you, you are you in virtue of being the same body. Now, the standard challenge with the body view is just exactly the sort of replacement problem, that it seems like every part of my body could be replaced with every part of your body over there, and yet my own first person sense of consciousness still be like over here. Okay. This is not something you can sort of verify from the outside. You have to like experience yourself existing even while you like clip your fingernails or whatever, and, you know, or as you just grow over time, you know. And so, so there is this problem. It's a widely recognized problem that philosophers will point to as a reason to think that maybe the body view is not the best account of your identity. So then another view is called the psychological identity view. And this is the view that what makes your identity is your psychological continuity. So you have enough of the sort of same memories or the same feelings, the same thoughts over time, and that's what makes you you. You might want to illustrate this in terms of popular movies where you have like consciousness uploaded into machines and stuff, and you have this feeling like, well, that's the same being in that machine, even when they, you know, download that consciousness, put it into another machine. It's the same being as long as it has the same sort of psychology, the same sort of kinds of thoughts, same personality. That would be the psychology.
Except that none of those movies and even none of the current research actually says how those memories and images and experiences will become self-aware in the first place.
In the first place, yes, there's also that construction problem as well. Yes,
absolutely.
So this is an additional problem. Yes,
it's what you have been what you have actually. What I think I understood from what you have been saying now is that if through introspection I can look into myself and think of an image and realize that an image on its own cannot be thinking, it is me who is thinking about the image, not the image who is thinking about itself. Yes. And then the question is, it means that all the images of all memories and all objects and all geometric shapes and all experiences in my mind are essentially the reflection of myself reflecting on them. They don't have their own standing. To the extent if I take all of those imprints in my brain and move them into a computer, if at all we know how to do that, it will mean nothing because the computer cannot reflect on them just like I am reflecting on them. So do you agree that all those science fiction propositions, or even sometimes people pose them as scientific propositions, are essentially completely missing the point of who is really reflecting on what? Is it the thought that is thinking, the geometric shape that is thinking, or the first person who is thinking of them? Is that a correct statement in your opinion?
No, I love that. I mean, there's still the question of the who is the one that has the perspective.
Absolutely.
Just working on this morning, it's like there's this kind of famous problem of figuring out which body in the room is yours, and you think, well, that's trivial, we can answer that. The body that's mine is the one that I can experience myself controlling. Oh, you can experience yourself controlling. Well, there's lots of people there's many experiences of controlling bodies. Which experiences are your experiences? Just being aware of experiences of controlling a body doesn't give you the awareness of which ones are yours. And to answer that, I think you do have to have a kind of self-awareness of the subject in addition to the psychology, in addition to the experience. There's the subject of the experience. And this does lead to a kind of famous problem with the psychological view. One way that this gets illustrated is in the transporter case. So in the transporter, you get into the transporter. This is like Star Trek, transportation, where it annihilates your body. disintegrates it, makes a duplicate body on the planet, gives you the same personality. So it's like, okay, you successfully transported. But one day you get into the transporter and there's a malfunction. It does duplicate your body, but it fails to destroy the body on the transporter. Now the question is, which one is you? Now the problem there, the reason why this poses a problem is that merely having the same qualitative psychological experiences doesn't answer that further subject question, which is the question of what is the thing that's you? So in a way, the psychological identity solution kind of skates over the very question we're trying to solve, which is what's the thing that's the subject of the psychology? So one more solution very quickly is what's called the soul view. Now, people might be anticipating this must be my view. It's actually not. So the soul view says, you know what actually carries your identity is your soul. So you're the same person from moment to moment because you have the same soul from moment to moment. Okay, in my view, the soul view just labels the very mystery. It's basically saying, call the thing that is you soul, give it that name. But it's kind of distracting because you haven't really solved the problem. You've just labeled the problem. You just said, well, whatever it is that maintains identity, we'll just call that a soul. I would rather just say this. This is my solution, which is that you are the thing that you witness in first person self-awareness. You actually perceive yourself when you look within and you witness yourself having thoughts, feelings. You are the subject. And that first person self-awareness is a clear window into you. It's not all of you, okay? It's not that that's, you see all of yourself through first person experience, just that you are seeing yourself. And that reality that you see within is the subject of your consciousness. And so I actually think there's a kind of basic identity. It's not everything has sort of a further explanation in terms of explaining how it could be identical. There's a kind of basic identity that you have. You are a kind of basic unit of reality that has thoughts and feelings. And this is, by the way, is again why there's a problem with building people merely out of machine parts, is because these machine parts, even if they carry their own basic identities, whatever whole that we construct out of it, its identity is in a sense, it's grounded in terms of the identities of the parts. And so that's why there's a problem with swapping the parts. How do you maintain your identity if you swap the parts? But if instead the whole or the person can be prior to the parts, it could have an identity that's independent of or prior to its parts, then I think we can solve this identity problem in a way that really makes sense of our own experiences.
Let me understand further your comment about the soul. Do you think there is something wrong about people calling who they are their souls, or you're just saying that it just doesn't explain anything? It's just a different label.
Yeah, the label is okay. I'm okay with that word. I mean, I'm even okay with somebody saying I'm a kind of natural object, just as long as we recognize that by a natural object, we don't mean the kind of reductive naturalism that analyzes me purely in terms of third person geometrical or functional aspects. I think a lot of times people talk past each other because of vocabulary differences and concept differences. But yeah, so I have no problem with the word soul if somebody wants to use that label, or if somebody wants to use another label. But I like to say that I'm a subject or a substance that has first person conscious awareness.
Yeah. For example, I would call that person who has the first person aware other object other than the reductive view of myself being a material machine. I would call it my soul.
Yeah.
Yet,
I think that's
then the question
fair.
is, what would be a soul?
Yeah, exactly.
Turns out, for example, for myself as a Muslim, we have this challenge that, or statement that human beings will never have access to explain what a soul is other than it being a soul kind of thing.
That's kind of what I'm saying. Yeah. It's
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Which also means another profound thing is that since you can never construct what you can never understand, it means that humans cannot construct consciousness apart from their own. And you talk a lot in your book and your talks about the construction problem.
Yeah.
Number one, do you agree that we cannot construct awareness and cannot construct consciousness, and what would be the central piece of that argument, in your opinion?
Yeah, this takes us back to what I want to call the kind of the materials problem. You need the sort of right materials. And I think there's actually kind of a collection of different problems related to the materials problem. This has become clear in my own work that there's specific problems with constructing thoughts, and then other problems with constructing experiences or like feelings, and then other material problems with constructing perception. But I want to just kind of focus here with you on perception, because what perception does is it unifies consciousness into that first person perspective. And what's interesting about a first person perspective is that it's not just consciousness, it's organized consciousness. And we've kind of hinted at this. One way of illustrating the construction problem, constructing a perspective, is that imagine that we somehow are able to build a thinking chip. So this is our thinking chip, and it is thinking. It's like literally having thoughts. It's generating thoughts and having the thoughts it generates. And then this is a feeling chip. And then we're very ambitious. We want a intending chip, a chip that's able to intend courses of actions. So we succeed. Now, I do think I do.
Yeah, I'm asking. So we'll start by like assuming that we can have this situation where we can have consciousness divided into pieces. And now what you're trying to do is like put the pieces of consciousness together, right?
That's it.
So
yes.
Thought, intent, and feelings.
Yes. And there's deep problems. So they're just right away, I want to make sure this is clear. There are deep problems with building out of mindless matter a thought, okay, or a thinking chip. In fact, I have an article about these problems. It's based on a counting argument, which I'm not going to go into, but I've been able to deduce from certain first principles that many people find plausible a theorem that shows this problem. But let's say we can solve that problem for sake of argument. We can build a thinking chip. And I don't just mean a functioning as if it thinks, but like it has that conscious sense of aboutness, okay, and a feeling chip and an intending chip. So we built the three chips. But now there's this further problem, which has to do with how these chips can be bound together into a single subject that thinks, feels, and intends all at the same time. And the problem is not solved just by stacking the chips on each other or putting them close together, because that's kind of like stacking a bunch of people on top of each other, putting them close together. You don't thereby make a super person that is a subject of all of our consciousness. Like, no. Putting people together just puts together different perspectives, different first person awarenesses. And so that is part of this construction problem. Merely having chips that can do the things that bits of consciousness could do doesn't give us the unified subject of conscious experience. Does that make sense?
Great.
What do you think about that?
Actually, it makes great sense, and I would like also to put to you some of the discussions that I have had. So I have had plenty of discussions with evolutionary biologists, and so one of the major problems with Darwinism, for example, is the appearance of multicellular organisms. All right. So let me give you this example of a human being. A human being is like 30 to 40 trillion cells, if you only count the human cells. And then you have like 30 to 40 trillion bacteria living inside of us. But and then there is this very tricky thing, is that if one way or the other you can stitch cells together that used to be independent cells, single cellular organisms living independently. Evolutionary biologists, for example, and Darwinists are saying that one day life was unicellular, that continued to be for the majority of the age of life on the planet. And then at a point of time, suddenly we have animals and plants that are multicellular. And then they would go like this, like those cells were in a condition where they had to come together in colonies, and then the colonies merged.
Yeah.
And I was having this discussion with one evolutionary biologist, and I'm telling him, no, it's completely different to have symbiotic relationship between entities that have separate identities. So, for example, myself and Josh, we are sharing, we are roommates, and I will bring the table, you will bring the chair. Okay, so I don't have to buy a table and a chair, and you don't have to buy a table and a chair. One table from me, one chair from you will do the job. This is one thing. And myself and Josh now becoming the same person is a completely different thing.
Yes.
And the reason is that we had separate identities, and there cannot be any evolutionary price that I am willing to give away my identity for. Because once I give my identity to a bigger creature, it either means that one of us has died or both of us have died. And they just couldn't get it. They couldn't get it. And I think the reason they cannot get it is the reductionist view. So even if you start with an entity that has complete awareness and another entity that has complete awareness, there is another, I think there is another level of the construction problem that I would really recommend if you can address it in your book, which is, can you actually even construct a higher level of awareness from two complete awarenesses or not?
Yeah.
I would say not.
Yeah, I do talk about this in this book. I've got a chapter on the binding problem, and it's completely in addition to the construction problem with constructing particular contents of consciousness, thoughts, feelings, desires, etc. It is this problem of combining them together. And I think maybe one of the difficulties with even kind of having a conversation about this in the context of thinking about evolutionary biology is that the evolutionary biologist is trying to answer different questions in a way. I mean, there's a way in which evolutionary biology can provide great explanatory power to explain many of the kinds of things that we witness. But what you're pointing to and what I'm pointing to is something that even if you have a complete evolutionary system, and I've simulated these, I've done some work on complex adaptive systems where I created, in a sense, artificial life forms and let them multiply on my screen. And I was testing some hypotheses. But what's interesting about those experiments is that they had nothing to do with consciousness. I mean, none of my hypotheses were even addressing the question of how can fully aware conscious beings come together to form a super conscious being, not just a collection of little conscious beings, but a new subject of consciousness. You know, how is that possible? And now here, the question doesn't say that it's impossible. Just the question says that merely having sort of evolutionary explanations of natural selection is not even addressing how to solve that question. So
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. It's just addressing that we will bring different pieces of furniture to the room, or maybe even if you have very good hands and I have very good feet, that I will carry you on my shoulder and you will do the building of the rest of the room with your hands or something, because with my hands I cannot reach very high up, and with your feet you need somebody to carry you. But we will never merge into one person that has 4 legs and 4 hands, or I will completely lose my hands and you will completely lose your legs. But even if both of us each loses 2 limbs, it will not make us the same person. It will just make us 2 persons who are complementing each other. And for some reason, the reductionists, I think they choose not to get it. They just choose not to get it.
I'm not gonna assume volition there, but I really do think that people are kind of working on different questions. And I just want to say, for me, in my work in the philosophy of mind, it took me a while to even understand what the philosophers were worried about. I mean, I remember, I can tell you, before I took courses in the philosophy of mind, thinking all we need to get consciousness is enough of a complex brain. I just thought consciousness just is a certain kind of complexity. And it wasn't until I took courses reading philosophers, naturalistic philosophers, pointing to these problems with consciousness, the sort of qualitative aspect of consciousness, that merely changing the complexity of a system doesn't thereby give us that first person qualitative aspect. And so I think that one of the challenges with having these conversations is that not everybody is kind of looking at the same questions or looking at the same data, and especially if the problem of consciousness is sort of presented as a kind of objection to the evolutionary explanations that are trying to explain or answer other problems or other questions. I think that can kind of lead to maybe a contest of ideas that can become distracting. But that actually, I mean, I fully agree with you that there is this binding problem of like merely getting conscious beings together doesn't thereby give us a new conscious subject. And when I think about that, I mean, I'm tempted to say it's just not, it really isn't possible to generate new conscious subjects just by organizing other conscious subjects or unconscious subjects, which actually does lead to a very deep puzzle. Well, then how do you get conscious subjects?
Absolutely, because if we go back to our original subject, which is can AI get consciousness? So,
Yes.
for example, in science fiction, the Skynet issue, for example, the very famous Terminator series, and in many other ones, like iRobot, for example, where you have this nano technology based supercomputer that has. The argument is, okay, one computer is a miniature of a very weak computing device, which is taken in analogy to a brain. But maybe if we put together so many computers, if we connect the whole internet in a specific arrangement, then all of those little computers coming together into this one huge brain, silicon brain in this case, electronically driven, will now become conscious, will now become self-aware. And obviously they are now starting from a collection of unconscious parts trying to generate an overarching consciousness.
Yeah.
So what would you say about that?
I think that does result in the host of construction problems that we're talking about. And I think that you can actually get some insight into these just by example. I mean, that's why I kind of like to use these examples, because it's not just that I don't know whether this thing's going to start feeling sad once I do this. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that actually I do know. I'm reasonably sure. Now maybe there's some way in which something's feeling sad if I do this, but then I'm going to think that it's not merely in virtue of the geometric changes. It's going to be in virtue of some other reality that's already capable of consciousness.
Absolutely.
So my theory of the world is that in order for there to be a consciousness emerging, there already has to be the kind of subject that has the capacity for consciousness. If these things are,
there has to be fundamental consciousness to arrive to other degrees of consciousness. Is that what you mean?
That's the way of putting it. There has to already be, and we can talk about how deep the consciousness goes if it goes all the way down to the foundations, but at least there has to be the kind of being, the kind of substance or subject that has a capacity for consciousness. So if these things aren't like that, then merely changing their geometries isn't going to thereby spark consciousness. And this, I think, does lead to a kind of fundamental consciousness, because now you just think about, okay, well, if there already has to be a subject of consciousness in order for consciousness to emerge, when I say a subject, I mean the kind of thing that can have consciousness, okay, then if consciousness ever emerges, that means that there's already a subject of consciousness, the kind of thing that can have consciousness. But if instead, if the fundamental layer of reality just, let's say, are geometric objects that aren't themselves subjects of consciousness, they're not themselves capable of consciousness, then merely rearranging those things into new forms and configurations will never be able to thereby, all on their own, have consciousness or generate real first-person experiences. And I want to say, actually, as I've been thinking about this, I think earlier when I was thinking about this, I had words like materialism that maybe were sort of targets in my mind for maybe implying the construction problem. But as I've actually studied more of kind of what the physicists are saying about the nature of matter, I've kind of opened up my terms so that I'm kind of thinking like it could be that on some broad definition of matter, as long as matter is not fundamentally characterized in terms of geometry, but if you just think of it as whatever that stuff is out of which other things are made, well, then on that sort of concept, then we can explain how consciousness arises out of that stuff out of which other things are made, if that stuff itself is a subject of consciousness or the kind of thing that can make consciousness. And so that kind of makes sense to me as a way of maybe unifying some different perspectives, while also avoiding the construction problems that we've been talking about. So I don't know what you think about some of that in terms of language, but I've just been finding that sometimes there's maybe unnecessary obstacles to joint inquiry because people are using different vocabulary. But then as I sort of read what they're saying, I'm thinking, no, actually, you're kind of saying something similar, just with other language. And especially some of the stuff, the recent stuff on the fundamental nature of matter being itself prior to or explaining the emergence of space and time, that there's actually this more basic layer in the quantum field. Sometimes quantum field theorists are talking about this. Now, this is not my area, so I don't want to be too confident or bold in my thoughts about this, but I'm just hearing what the quantum field theorists are saying, and I'm thinking, okay, if what you're saying is right, if what Carlo Rovelli is saying, he's a leading quantum field theorist, is saying is right, then we can actually understand the fundamental nature of matter in terms of the kind of first-person subjective reality that we witness within our own selves. But that leads to a kind of paradigm shift that might be too radical, right? And so, I don't know what people think about that, but I do think that there's room here for sort of reconceiving of how we even think of matter itself, and that can help us understand where consciousness comes from and how it could arise.
All right. So I will take you to two questions that are really thought-provoking and probably will take us to theology. So the first one is actually three questions. So the first one is actually a summary of what we've just said. So do you sleep at night comfortable that tomorrow Skynet is not going to be self-aware?
Yes, I do. However,
okay.
I do think it's theoretically possible that there could be some kind of psychophysical law, sort of a law of mind and body, such that once you organize matter into certain shapes, maybe the fundamental mind produces self-awareness into the objects, right? So in that way, it's not Skynet and all in virtue of its third-person material properties being self-aware. It's that maybe there's a weird psychophysical law that we could discover or tap into to generate that self-awareness. And that I have not ruled that out through my analysis, but I do find it quite impossible for mere computer chips to be organized into self-awareness. Yeah.
All right. And then it takes us to the second question. Well, my personal perspective on the first one is actually if I was more of looking at it purely from a scientific and material perspective, probably I would have said the same question. But since from both science and philosophy, I have certain theological views that are themselves rooted also in science and theology. And in my religion, there is this challenge that humanity can never generate even a fly. And I think a fly has the three things: the material, life, and self-awareness. A fly knows that it's a fly. None of us have been a fly before, but we probably know that a fly, like a cat, like a dog, they know that they are. They know that they have their being. And there's this challenge in Islam, for example, that humanity, if it all comes together, will not be able to create a fly. I had a long discussion with Dr. James Toole, for example, the synthetic chemist, and he was saying, well, we don't even dream of creating a fly. Even one single unicellular organism is totally outside of our reach. No matter how good we know about the arrangement of the materials, if you dehydrate it, if you get a living cell, you dehydrate it, and then you hydrate it again, it will not come alive, no matter what you do. So it seems that there is something extra. But then it takes us to our second question. Now, if we, for example, imagine this, okay, we give up. We know that we cannot do it on our own. We somebody like Elon Musk, for example, he's doing so much work on Neuralink, etc. And then he can map the complete brain of somebody. And now let's not think of uploading the person in terms of the person is dying and we're uploading him. Let's assume that the person is living. And we're uploading him. Okay. And then after we finish the uploading, we cut the connection. Well, is it possible that we find another Ahmed or another Josh living in the machine? Or one of us has to die, or it will produce nothing at all. It will just produce a fictitious Ahmed who only knows what has been uploaded there. What do you think is the answer to this question?
Well, it might take some experiments really to find out. However, I do agree with what you were saying about sort of the role of God in producing even a fly, because I do think that you need some kind of right substance or subject of consciousness to produce the kinds of things that can have self-awareness. And so I do think that in answer to the second question, that it would not be just in virtue of the physical properties, the third person characterizable physical properties. If you turn off the switch, then no, there's not going to be a subject there unless, and this is the big unless, that subject itself emerges out of the fundamental subject, or if that subject is itself in some way fundamental. And it sort of, it doesn't emerge, it was already there. And it's just operating through the shapes of the machine. So that's kind of how I would think about that. Like, I do think there's an in principle construction problem with getting self-awareness purely without the right kind of materials. So yeah, those are my thoughts about that. What do you think?
Well, I would tell you three things.
Yes.
The first one, let's assume that we build a program, just from my background as in informatics. Let's say we build a program and we ask you a million questions, okay? And we get every answer. And those are the all 1 million questions that we can ask you given your knowledge. Of course, we have the problem that you can think of something completely out of the blue, which we cannot know. We'll just ask you all 1 million questions that you can possibly answer. And then we take this. I take it, for example, as somebody who would program it into a machine. And then somebody who comes will ask the machine and will ask you, and guess what? He will get the same answer because we've programmed it already. And we've been very smart.
Yeah.
And let's say that this is the best approximation that we can get to uploading your brain. All right? Because I've asked your brain every possible question that it can answer, and I've put it into another machine. And this machine, I will even model it as a neural network. So I will train it with the questions with the way we train neural networks, with deep learning and everything. So this is the way we are actually answering the questions. So I will show it a picture, and this picture is your son or your brother or your wife or your father and your mother. And then you will say, this is who, and all of this will be recorded in the neural network. And then my answer is that the neural network will not know what the hell it's talking about. It is essentially, all what it's doing is that it's spilling out what has been already programmed into it.
Yes.
So whether we are doing this by feeding in through deep learning or whatever other computer learning mechanism, or just an algorithm, or just a huge database of questions and answers, or actually mapping the state of each and every neuron in your brain, will not actually make a difference. What we will have is my second representation. Is if you stand in front of a mirror, and the mirror does not only reflect your image, but this is a big mirror that can actually reflect your sound, the temperature of your body. It's a 3D mirror with audio-visual material properties, to the extent that it has this very fast 3D printer that's 3D printing a picture of you on the other side, just like the teleporter or transporter example that you have given in Star Trek.
Yes.
the other person on the other side of the mirror is by no means, in my thought experiment, conscious. He is just a reflection. He is just a third person reflection to the real first person who is you. I've actually
Yeah.
created nothing more than that. So if the extent of the human knowledge is to transfer the whole of human knowledge and reactive responses into one big machine, if you do this for all 8 billion humans on Earth now, and nobody knows how many other tens of billions who have lived before us, this machine will still be unconscious, because the best that it can dream of being is to be this one big mirror.
Yeah.
So I don't think that I cannot find this thought experiment where the neural network will actually start really thinking or really having genuine feelings. Essentially will not have its own first person. I cannot
Yeah.
think of any way to
Yeah.
reach to that.
No, I'm totally with you on that. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
the only way would be if there is something else going on. But in that case, it's not the third person geometric reality that is explaining the consciousness. In fact, I like your metaphor of the mirror, because it really is a mirror of a deeper reality. It's a reflection. I've thought about
Absolutely.
this in terms of our own experience of our brains. Our experience of our brains is a reflection of what I call a user interface, which is basically a conscious substance's interaction, sort of codes and programs for interacting with the world. But the experience of that user interface, and the user interface itself, is not the thing that's conscious. It's rather a mirror reflection of the subject that's conscious. So yeah, I'm totally with you on
And,
that. Yeah.
actually, I love your example so much. And I was having this interview with a physician, with a medical doctor, and we were discussing things, aspects of the human body, and then we went into mind at the end of the presentation. I'll share it with you maybe after the show.
Yeah.
And he was telling me this. He was telling me, look, the eye will capture photons, and it will convert those photons into electrical impulses, action potentials traveling through the neurons. And then it will reach some place in the brain where it will create an imprint on a set of neurons in the brain. But he says this, that the ear is listening to sound waves, and it converts those mechanically through those little bones into those little vibration receptors in the ear, and then it creates action potentials in the neurons, and then it creates a certain imprint in the neurons in the brain. And he tells me this, that as an external observer, the neurons are the neurons, and the electrical imprints are the electrical imprints. The only reason that we perceive this as an image and that as sound has nothing to do with the brain itself.
Okay.
The brain
What was
itself
his
is
explanation?
the brain itself is totally agnostic, because it's the same neuron, and it just has an on or off state, or essentially an chemical / electrical impulse. And actually, his explanation, I loved his explanation, because it's pretty similar to my explanation. I shared a video with you, is that essentially the perception of those imprints in the brain is because the real first person is looking at the brain, and this real person, who is the real me, will interpret the electrical impulses in this part of the brain as a picture, and in that part of the brain as sound. And just exactly as I'm looking to the monitor in front of me now, or to the laptop screen, and to the screen, you are just 400 by 400 pixels, and the pixels in themselves are not you, but they are just three colors beside each other. And another part of the screen is showing letters. And at the end of the day, it is me who is interpreting that part of the screen as a person, who is you, and the other part of the screen as text. It is me who is making text text that corresponds to speech, and that other part a picture who is you. And then the question is, who is the person who is looking at the brain,
Yeah.
which is
Right.
in this analogy corresponding to the monitor? So
Yeah.
again, it brings us back to the machine. If by any means we build this great machine that has all those bits in it, and those bits will be images and pictures and sounds and geometric representations of 3D objects in the real world, then the question is, no matter how sophisticated and how big that computer memory is, who will be looking is the question.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the
Who,
subject?
who is
Yeah.
actually, in terms of us, we have this machine, which is our brain that has all those imprints, but obviously the machine is not looking into itself. There has to be somebody who's looking.
Yeah.
And to me, this is what I call a soul that I cannot explain, but I know that my brain on its own, there's nothing physical in the brain that says that this is an audio representation and this is a video representation, and that is feeling of pain,
Yeah.
and that is feeling of pressure, and that is feeling of smell, and that is feeling of taste, etc. They're all just the same good old neuron with an electrical or a chemical / electrical state. That's what it is. So who's doing the interpretation becomes the question.
Yeah. Well, and I love that example. And what you're pointing to is the value of actually paying attention to who you are through introspection. Because this is where, in order to even appreciate the question you're asking, who is it? You're looking at the neurons, you're looking at the little, the geometric realities, the shaped things, right? Maybe the color, maybe they have color. The reason you can ask this further question, well, who is it? Who's interpreting the structures? Who's experiencing the audio and the visual? Who is it? The reason you can even ask that question is because you recognize within your own consciousness yourself as a who. And you actually have to do the work to sort of see that, to even appreciate the question. I think sometimes and I could just say from my own perspective, when I was sort of thinking about this for the first time, I was thinking about the complexity of the brain and thinking about how that complexity could maybe all on its own generate aspects of consciousness. But what I was not thinking about, I wasn't really paying attention to the who, my own consciousness, the subject. And that's what leads to, I think, the insight that you're pointing to. And I think it is an insight. It's an insight that mere geometric expressions is not enough to give you the consciousness, the subject of consciousness, not just the consciousness, but the who, the one who is conscious.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm hitting at here is that this who cannot be the brain itself. It has to be, and if the brain is the pinnacle of our physical existence, then the who is beyond that.
And I want to say, if the brain is fundamentally a geometric object, because there's also even a vocabulary problem here. Sometimes I wonder, well, maybe the brain is whatever's behind my visual experience of a geometric object. Maybe the geometry is just in my experience. And so now the word brain is like a pointer to whatever it is. It's the who that has my consciousness. Well, then the word brain just points to the same thing as the word soul points to. It's the subject of consciousness that you know through first-person experience. But, and here's the big point that you're pointing out, if a brain is fundamentally a geometric object, then no, it's the wrong kind of thing. Geometric objects, just like visual images, are not the kind of thing they're not who's.
Absolutely.
Those are the things that belong to who's. Geometries belong to the contents of visual imagery of a who, but they aren't themselves the who. And so I think it's like you're confusing the image or the picture of that represents the who with the who that right within your own first person. This is why I think the clearest way to know who you are is first and foremost through looking within and just saying, oh, it's me. It's me.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. And I mean, brain science helps us to know more about your capacities and how you can act in the world. And so it's wonderful. But it doesn't give us the whole picture of you, because it leaves out the who that you witness in first person experience. At least that's how it looks to me from my own thinking about this. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Actually, I have another insight from religion. I can tell you this from Islam, but I'm also almost pretty sure it's the same in Christianity. in Islam, the seat of the self is the heart, not the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Some would say that it's a metaphor, but personally, I think it's not a metaphor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
The heart has your emotions.
yeah, so I mean, it's not the physical pump,
Yeah.
but it's something about this place in the body where it's like the seat of the soul, one way or the other. And I think you will probably find statements in the Bible where it's referring to the heart as you. I'm not sure. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misquoting the verse, but I think it's something like a fool says in his heart there is no God or something. So it's like it's in your heart. Belief is in the heart. Emotions are in the heart. Convictions are in the heart. And then the way I'm thinking, if we would relate the physical existence to the real who, the real who is somehow sitting in the heart, and from the heart he is looking at this user interface, if you'd like to call it, a transducer, maybe, if I would like to give it a name that relates to communications and computing. And this person, we can then look into things like NDE, where, for example, somebody who is, physically, people would think that he's not there, but he's still having experiences, and or somebody who's asleep and he's having experiences, and he's having experiences of body and visuals and audio and pain and smell,
the feelings
and
that you
taste.
have in your heart, even though they're looking down at their body, they're doing heart surgery, they're like, I can see my heart down there, but I'm still feeling love. How is this, right? It's because that physical pump, that quote physical pump, you could sort of think about its geometry as itself a content of experience, which represents other experiences. And so this is what I sort of think of the geometry of the body as maybe in total, it's a kind of user interface for interacting with the world. But then when we talk about the heart part of the body, then I could think of that as even a certain kind of user interface in relation to this physical context. So when we're in this state of existence, then there's a certain kind of interplay between certain emotions and effects in the rest of our body. And so this can all go together. But then the point is the reason you can have that NDE, that near-death experience, where you're actually seeing and hearing and feeling. I mean, it's so funny. They're not, I shouldn't say funny, but like interesting to me that there are cases where people report seeing in color for the first time in their NDE. So they're born colorblind, and then it's during their NDE they have the color visual experience. Like, well, what's going on there? I mean, are their eyes giving them the color? It's like, well, maybe the eyes are facilitating or even representing the user interface for seeing in this context. But once you are, in a sense, released from this context, then you're not constrained through seeing through this context. It's sort of like if you're in a car, you can see outside the window, you get out of the car, you can still see what you could see from in the car, but you can now see it maybe more fully or from a different context. And I think this understanding of the who and the self as being prior to the geometric representations really makes good sense of these NDE reports, it seems to me.
Yeah, so it even to me, when I'm thinking of, people trying to upload somebody's brain to make him live longer or live eternally on a machine, and I'm laughing, guys, you're uploading the wrong piece.
Yeah. The wrong piece.
He's not there. And if you try to go to the heart, you will find nothing. You'll just find blood and muscles. Because it's not the material piece. It is just the seat of the person, but it's the chair is not the person,
I want to ask you. Yeah, go ahead, and then I have a question for you.
Then I'll just say the question, and then so that and then you go ahead and ask. The third thing is this miracle of a woman giving birth, essentially, Because if all humanity cannot put together a conscious, self-aware thing, how come 1 of 4 billion women over the planet can just create a new conscious being, being
This
a
was my
child?
question. I was just going to ask you that question.
Oh,
Yes. So thank you for bringing
amazing.
it up.
Amazing.
Yes, because the question is pointing to some kind of correlation between changes in the physical world that results in pregnancy and then the emergence of a conscious being. And so then this is kind of what leads us back to this question, like, well, could you build a machine that's conscious by changing the geometric world? You know, you change the geometry of your body in relation to the geometry of another body, and then somehow through causal interactions, a woman is pregnant with a conscious being. How does that happen? Does that mean consciousness can emerge from just these geometric changes? That was going to be my question for you. Now you're asking me the question, but I would love to hear kind of what you think about that. How does that work?
Yeah. So actually, there are like 4 aspects to the answer to that question. The first one is that if you get a living person with all his parts intact and he's dead, and you try to resuscitate him, you can't. And if this person is as young as a baby, so his body is so hungry to life, not aged, not you still can't. If a baby is born dead, he's dead. There's no way to bring him alive.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second question is it the physical arrangement of the baby, like a sperm and an egg coming together, that is really doing the trick? And the answer in theology, in Islamic theology, for example, that a person becomes a person after on the 41st day.
Mm-hmm.
So at the 41st day, this physical arrangement is ready to receive an external, the who comes here.
Mm-hmm.
So in Islam, there is a hadith that on the 40th day, an angel would deposit a soul into a baby, and then he becomes a person, which answers the moral question of abortion, for example. When is a abortion like killing a baby or just destroying a piece of biomass?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in Islam, for example, it is after 40 days, but definitely before 120 days. So there is no choice, for example, in Islam, to kill a baby that is beyond 120 days, because this is not anymore a biomass. This is a person. For sure, it's a person. And after 40 days, you have to watch it. You have to have very good reasons to do that. So the answer to that question from the theological aspect, when does the arrangement become a person, is that the arrangement never becomes a person.
Yeah.
The arrangement becomes ready to receive a person at a certain point of time. Now, why does that specific certain point of time becomes a valid container for the person of a human being, for example?
Mm-hmm.
Because in other creatures, they become creatures maybe earlier than 40 days or later than 40 days. But for some reason, a human being, and we can only know this from Revelation, one way or the other. And then the other, I told you 4 things. And then the third thing is that God, for example, in the example of Jesus, for example, so in Islam, for example, Jesus is fatherless, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So it did not take the arrangement of a sperm and an egg to have Jesus. Because if God wants to deposit his gift just at an egg and cause it to produce Jesus, he can actually do that, because the aspect of producing the extra person of Jesus versus the one person of only Virgin Mary, but now they are Virgin Mary plus Jesus, is all about the introduction of the extra element. And then there is the example of Adam, himself, where the arrangement was done completely outside of a woman because there was no woman. And then guess what? Doing the arrangement on aged clay or something, and just depositing the extra piece, directly from God in this case, creates Adam.
Mm-hmm.
And there is actually there's the fifth one, which is that you can actually take a piece of Adam, which we obviously cannot do. You can take a piece of Adam, whatever that is,
Mm-hmm.
and call it Eve, and deposit the extra person of a woman and create the first woman. So it seems that all the four, the other four, the latter four versus the first one, that we cannot actually replicate it, even if we have a full-grown baby,
Yeah.
we cannot make him alive.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have all the parts, but the extra piece is not there, we cannot do it. And then the four are telling us it can be the arrangement of a sperm of an egg, but only at the point, a certain point, it gets an extra element, and that can be done without a father, or without a mother, or without any of them.
Yeah.
So you have Adam, Eve, Jesus, and a typical human being.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems that it's discretionary, but since the laws of nature have to be, perpetual, that it happens in a certain way, so that we can have a rule of life.
Yes.
But then the challenge becomes, if you have a baby, you have all the parts of the baby. Why don't you bring him alive? This this becomes the question. So what are your reflections on that?
I love that. I was actually thinking of an analogy that can maybe help bring out what your points are. So think about these multiplayer games where my kids, they like to play Minecraft, and so they'll get together on their screens and they all spawn into this. My 3-year-old uses the word spawn. He's talking about spawn. He asked my wife Rachel. He was like, Mom, like, when I die, will I respawn? He literally asked this question. He's 3 years old. He's like, will I respawn? So think about a multiplayer game. Now you might wonder why the games have certain rules about like where you spawn. So some games, it depends on the game, right? There might be a spawning station where you like spawn here and not over here. Well, why do they have those rules? Well, the rules create a certain kind of organization for that game. So there are rules of spawning. But what you're pointing to when you're saying that the mere arrangement of sperm and egg isn't automatically enough is you're pointing to the fact that or you're highlighting the concept that merely having a game where there's like a spawning station ready to receive a character is not enough for the character to come in. And even when the character does come in, the geometric reality is not the subject of consciousness, right? When my kids are playing, their avatars are in the game, but the subjects of consciousness are prior to the game. And you could really imagine, because part of what makes this hard to imagine is that they're conscious of things outside the game and of things in the game. But if you put on the headset, so you get like fully immersed. Donald Hoffman, he's a physicist. He talks about consciousness, and he uses this example of a headset. Like, imagine if you were like born into a headset and you didn't even know, like, it was put on you. And so you're having this experience of the game, and you think that is your reality. But then later you take the headset off, and now you come into like a new reality. And what this is illustrating is that there can be rules for entering into certain states of consciousness. And those rules then provide a kind of organization. This is why I like to talk about the user interface model of the brain. It's like the brain, even the heart as well, provide a kind of interactivity for conscious beings, subjects, and their environment. And then, of course, this pushes back the question, well, where do the rules come from? Like why is there this environment in which conscious beings can arise? And I do think that purely from an analytical, empirical reflection, even putting theology aside, it makes sense to me that there's got to be some kind of substance or subject of consciousness that then generates the contexts for consciousness, the rules and the interactions. One thing I've been wondering about, and I don't have a very clear answer to this question, is how, in principle, even an omnipotent being could produce a soul or a self. Because sometimes when I think about it, it seems like a self is just like not the kind of thing that could be produced by any means, whether by matter or by mind. So I do wonder about that, but I mean, it seems like so this leaves me to think that, well, either somehow souls are anchored deeply into the foundations of reality, or if they are produced, they have to be produced by, like a supremely powerful, or supremely the kind of substance that could produce souls would be very special. So all of this, I think, amplifies your points there, and it shows that merely having physical geometric arrangements correlate with, babies coming forward is not thereby the full explanation of the consciousness of the subject of consciousness. It maybe could explain, as you put it, why there's now an opportunity for a conscious being to come in, but it doesn't thereby make the conscious being itself. That does seem quite right to me when I think about it.
Actually, your example is really marvelous, and it just says something, that when you have those games and the player is not connected, and you're seeing the characters that are the avatar disconnected from the real player, and they're just doing their thing, just standing there or doing an imitation of something. Those are not it only becomes conscious when it has a soul, and this soul is your kid who's really playing it.
That's it.
And I have this video where I think I shared that one with you, where I'm giving the analogy of this movie Avatar.
Yeah, I love that.
And in this case, the character is actually the avatar, the blue creature, and it has the full arrangement of a body, but it only comes to real life when the guy on the other side, gets in the machine, and now he's like controlling this puppet creature, and once he disconnects, the other creature falls to the ground. So I think at the end of the day, you and me are this avatar of the real us.
Yeah,
the
real bodies are the avatars.
The bodies are the avatars. Actually, the movie actually has a very profound I'm not sure if they meant it even, but it has a very profound thing, that we are just avatars, and our souls, we are here for a purpose, to be in this world, like the guy wanted to be in the avatar world. And for the soul to be able to interact through the rules of this world, it needs this avatar that it gets connected to at a point of time from the point of birth, at the 40 days, or somewhere between the 40 and 120 days. And when somebody cuts the connection, when he calls back the soul, that's it. And then you wake up. And there's this profound quotation from our prophet in Islam that says this. It's very profound, but I think only through analogies like this that I could understand it. And it says this in Arabic. It says, "An-nasu niyam fa-idha matu intabahu." People are asleep. When they die, they wake up.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
And then I'm remembering that those scenes in Avatar, where the guy is sleeping in this machine, and he needs to go into deep sleep, and then his mind goes into the avatar. And when they wake him up on the other side, the avatar falls dead, or essentially falls asleep. So the death of the avatar is the waking up of the real person. And also, for example, in the Quran, it tells us that sleeping is the miniature of death. So when we go to this state, like we're not so dead, but we're not so alive, it gives a level of liberty to our real person to roam around, to have experiences of its own. And since there is this connection that it's still with our body, it leaves a level of imprint on our brain. So we have those hazy memories, and it evaporates very fast when we wake up. And the same happens with NDEs, because I think not everything that happens in the NDE is very fully maybe. But the great thing is some, as you were saying, sometimes NDEs are very vivid to the extent that they have experiences that the person could have never have had when he was really fully alive. So all of those coming together now goes back to what you're saying. So what are those persons who are really wearing our bodies?
Yeah, I know the subject, the who. Well, I love
Yeah.
that you brought up the dreams, because I was gonna say that myself. I feel like we're very much in sync, and the ideas that we're having here, because when you go to sleep, it's kind of like your avatar stops. It's stationary on a bed or wherever you're sleeping. But then from your first person perspective, you're having experiences and thoughts. And it's funny, since I've been writing this book on consciousness, I've been sometimes while sleeping, I'll know that I'm sleeping and I'll be thinking about consciousness. So I've had a series of dreams like this where I'll be dreaming, and then in my dream, I'll realize, oh, I'm just dreaming. And I'll look out at the sky and the mountains. And I had this one where I was like, I wonder if I can generate a ball of geometry. And so I like intended for there to be a ball of geometry, and it worked. I actually got it to appear in the sky. And then I was like, hey, let me rotate it. And it started rotating across the field of my experience. Now, I have to tell you, I was still aware of myself having thoughts and feelings. I was aware of the who, even though I was not aware of the geometry of my body. And this, I
Yeah.
think, also illustrates that awareness of the geometry of a body is not awareness of the whole person. It's not awareness of the who. So yeah, when you go off to sleep, it's kind of like an example of death in a way, because to everybody else, your body has ceased, it's stopped moving, and yet you're still conscious. At least you can, you don't be while you're dreaming. So maybe it's something similar. It's like you change from one state to another is what happens. Um, and so this particular existence is a certain kind of state of conscious experience where we
Yeah.
have the experience of geometries. And let me, if I could just add something, for a long time, even after I took all these courses in graduate school and began to publish in the field of the philosophy of mind, I still kind of left it open whether I myself, as a subject of consciousness, might also be a geometric object. So it could be that maybe in principle, maybe I have both the sort of geometry of the body and the first person conscious experiences. And I think that that's, a viable hypothesis, and it's one that I've kind of entertained for many, many years. But I just have to say that recently, like in the last 2 years, I've changed my mind on that. I mean, that I reading Donald Hoffman's empirical case for the geometries being themselves contents of consciousness that are mind dependent, as well as my own analytical reflection on the contents of my dreams and the geometries in the dreams themselves, it leads me to think that actually the geometric objects, those really are, as you were saying, mirrors or reflections of the deeper reality. So it's not actually that literally I have the shape of this body plus also first person consciousness. It's rather that I'm the kind of thing that has first person consciousness plus also imagery of geometric configurations that then represent the underlying capacities and programs that allow me to interact with the environment. So that's my current
Absolutely.
working model, that I am not a geometric object, and that's not the kind of thing I am. But I also want to say, and even if I were a geometric object, my geometry wouldn't be fundamental to who I am. The who-ness of me is deeper in. That's the first person conscious reality. So that's where I'm at
Yeah.
on that. Yeah.
And you posted a question. If you'd like that, we talk about it a little bit. How can God, the supernatural being, spawn
Yeah.
other selves?
Selves. Yeah. How does that work?
Yeah,
Help me with
it's
that one.
it. It's a very great question.
Yeah.
And there is a story about that one in our tradition. And the story is about, there was a Jewish community in Medina, which is the place where the Prophet went to, immigrated to after he left his home country. And his compatriots in his city, they knew that there are Jews in Medina and Jews have revelation. So they're asking themselves, is he a prophet or not? Maybe we'll go ask the Jews, because the Jews, they have those sacred texts and they can test him.
Mm-hmm.
So they send a delegation to Medina, and the delegation tells them, ask him about three things. And according to the answer to the question, we can tell if he is a prophet or not. And the three things are: ask him about guys who went to a cave, and it's a story about three Christians who were persecuted, and a miracle happened to them, and they slept for like 300 years. So ask him about the youth who went to the cave, and then ask him about a man who is called Dil Qarnayn, the man of two horns. I think it's also like something that is in the Christian tradition. And then ask him about the soul. And then after some time, revelation came to the prophet, and he answered the two questions. He told the story. The Quran has the story of the youth who fled the Roman Empire and went to the cave, and then he tells the story of the man with the two horns, or the two ages, actually, because horn and age are the same word, so it's probably the man of the two ages. And then he says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. And they ask you about the soul. Say, the soul is ordained by my Lord. وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. And you have only been given from knowledge but a little. So the answer is, there is no answer.
It's that hard of a question. Even the prophet is saying, we have just a little insight into that. We don't have the full understanding of that. Is that what you're saying here?
Absolutely. And it says we don't even have the capacity to even like scratch the surface. We can only understand that this can only be possible by direct ordinance from God. But how does that work, and what is the essence of this thing called the soul? And the fun thing is that the Jews actually asked him about this question, and they knew that the right answer would be no answer.
So that he passed the test, because
so he passed the test. Now, regardless that they didn't all accept him, this is another topic. But they didn't come back and say he answered any of the questions wrong. So this is the whole thing. So it seems that this is, even in theology, the kind of question that the correct answer is that we do not have an answer. And it also leaves me sleeping well at night, knowing that my computer will not wake up and kill me because it doesn't like me.
It won't generate.
It won't emerge.
It
won't emerge. There is nothing there to emerge. So, Josh, I hope you have enjoyed this. For me, it was a blast.
Yes. Oh my goodness, you are so fun to talk with, and you've clearly thought very deeply and reflectively about these things, and this has been so much fun. I was just thinking, just kind of at the end here, I've been wondering, on this sort of deep, hard question of like, well, what is the source of a soul? Like, how can a self, that self that you witness inside, come to be? And I've been wondering if, when you look within and you see yourself, there's a sense in which deep within your own self is the original fundamental self, the sort of foundational self out of which all other selves spring forward. And that our connection to each other is actually much deeper than we often realize when we're looking at the world of geometries. Because in the world of geometries, we see spatial distances between objects. But what if actually there's no spatial distance between us at all, but that we're actually, each and every one of us as selves, anchored in the fundamental self? There's no distance between us. We're right connected. We're all one in that sense. And that we're also very special because our very existence is anchored in the existence of that fundamental self, that original consciousness. And that's something I've been wondering about and thinking a lot about, and actually thinking that sort of unity of the selves in the original self might be sort of maybe the best that we can do to understand the origin of a soul in this in our current context of limitation, in our current state of seeing sort of thinly through the veil. So that's where I'm at on that. I'm really at the edge of my thinking on this, and talking with you has just been wonderful. You helped me to kind of look at it from other angles, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you for those comments. It's really flattering, and your work is really actually magnificent. And I would really recommend for the audience to check out your books, and anxiously wait for your upcoming book, which I find to really address the topic in very thought intriguing ways, and very nice thought experiments and the construction problem, and really addressing the issue of emergence in very innovative ways. On the comment that you have just said, and I think that souls are not bound by space. Probably they are living in a dimension of their own when they are free, or actually for sure they are, but when they are in our bodies, they get limited by this interface.
Mm-hmm.
But then this explains why when we're asleep, we can meet people and have experiences with other people that are so spatially distant, because they are free and we are free. And even with dead people. I'm not sure if you have had experience of your own, but it's very well known that people can dream of dead people, and they can talk to them, especially if they're loved ones, and they can tell them things that they couldn't have otherwise known. And those dead people can be buried, hundreds or thousands of kilometers away, and sometimes they have only seen them very briefly when they were young, etc. So yeah, for sure, souls do not have our limitations, especially when they're free. And people who can have out-of-body experience even when they are conscious are definitely special. But it seems that some people can actually do it. I'm not sure if you're addressing that in one of your writings, but
I don't bring it in, but I am aware of some of the case studies that you're talking about, and it's a pretty interesting topic. Just that there has been, from what I've read, a more systematic and academic investigation into some of these things. This is not just sort of like this fringe topic, that there are people really taking seriously some of these reports, NDEs and out-of-body experiences, especially because, as you're saying, there are these reports where people are saying they're having experiences with events and even with beings that make sense of independent, verified information, but it's hard to make sense of purely in terms of what they would know about through their body. So it's a very interesting topic to me. Yes, I'm with you on that.
Actually, a fun fact that we have one of those incidents in our tradition. So it's not even with the prophet, it's one of his disciples, and he was giving a speech, and there was an army fighting a battle at a specific place. It was a faraway place. I think it was in Persia or something. And then while saying the speech, he just stops and he says, "The mountain, the mountain, the mountain," and just he continues. And the guy's sitting there, what is he talking about? And then after that, they ask him, "What were you talking?" He just stopped, and you called the name of a person, and you said the mountain, and then he said, "Sometimes I just utter things that I don't know, just let it pass." And then the army comes back a few months later, and the commander of the army says, "The enemy was attacking us from the mountain that was not guarded. It was completely out of our sight. And at a point of time, I hear the voice of Omar telling me the mountain, and we draw our attention to it, and we understand that there is an ambush." And it is, like it changed the course of that specific battle. And I'm sure you can find in your tradition something like this.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And those things are typically pretty. Sometimes they have great effects on specific historical events, etc. So it seems that this also says something about people who are of refined ascetic nature. They are not very bound to their material body in terms of their desires and in terms of their attachment to the material world. And in this case, their soul gets a level of freedom that is different from the typical person gets. A level of freedom related to their interests, related to their long-term goals, to their refined goals, kind of, to the extent they can have experiences like this, whether
Yeah.
looking outside of their body in space and sometimes in time,
Yeah.
obviously.
No, it's interesting because even in some recent neuroscientific studies that I've been reading, they're finding that the way you put it in terms of having a kind of like freedom from your body, they're finding that there is an inverse relationship between the sort of richness of the meditative experience and certain ways of measuring brain activity. Now, I want to sort of be careful in my pointing to these studies. They're open to different interpretations, but they do, I think, point to the kind of thing that you're talking about, which is that there can be a sort of richness of consciousness that can even affect the physical world and is not thereby itself explained all on its own in terms of the geometric states of the brain. In fact, it may go the other way. And there's, I think, really good neuroscience evidence that often it does go the other way. And this would even explain just ordinary common sense observations of how you can form a desire or an intention to go for a walk. And then maybe an hour later, your physical body is like over walking down a street. That's not just random. I mean, there's not a random coincidence. It's not a random coincidence that your feeling of the desire and intention is then correlated with subsequent changes to the physical world. And so this opens up a whole sort of range of considerations about the power of consciousness to affect the physical world. And so I guess I'm just going to leave it there. But you're pointing to that, which is just very interesting to me, because I think sometimes we limit our kind of vision of ourselves in terms of the material world. If we think that particles have to pull the strings on everything that happens, if we think that the material world has to explain everything. And then I think we sort of deplete our own awareness of our own powers to make real differences in the world. And that actually there are things we can do in our own minds, in our own consciousness. We can actually have like thankful thoughts towards others and think, have love for others. It actually affects, our hearts. Our
Absolutely.
physical hearts, and so it does make a difference here. And this is one of the reasons I think this topic is just so important. It's not just an academic topic. It actually has very real practical significance in how we think of ourselves and how we treat each other.
I think it has the most profound practical application, because if we at the end of the day believe that we are not our bodies, we are the first person is essentially a soul that is created by a supreme being. And then the question is, what are we doing here? Why have he separated us from this other dimension of being where we can just remain souls and not have attachment to the world? And then the answer would be in Revelation that we're here for a test, and that just like we went into the avatar, we'll leave it to face the consequences of our actions and the feelings and thoughts that we had towards other people, and how we affected this world, and did we leave it better or not? And then the answer becomes very profound, because it essentially determines our destiny, I think. So it's definitely not just a philosophical question. It is, I think it's a question. It's an existential question of destiny. Where are we destined? And since we, at the end of the day, using even your introspection test, we know that we have free will and we are accountable for those intents and actions. It says something very profound about what should our behavior be, and that we should be here waiting for accountability and putting it in mind, I guess.
Yeah, I love that, because it points to the greater purpose of our lives.
Absolutely. Josh, would you like to spend 10 minutes looking at audience questions, and we can also use it to cool off?
Sounds good.
All right. So first of all, that was really a blast, and you are really a fun person and very deep person to talk with. I just have to say that.
Thank you.
Here we have a comment from Walid saying, "I just joined your precious discussion. Good job. Thanks, Walid." We had Walid also saying consciousness means soul in theological language. I guess we have almost answered to that, right?
The only thing I would add is I want to say that the soul would be the subject of consciousness. And that's, I think, a very important distinction. It's not just that there's awareness of thoughts and feelings. There's the one who is aware, the you.
Yeah.
And yeah, you could use the word soul to point to that. Sometimes
Absolutely.
people make the distinction between having a soul and being a soul. I remember C.S. Lewis made this distinction. It's not that you have a soul, it's that you are a soul. And I'm sympathetic with that kind of language. It's not that there's this thing that's like part of you, that's the real you. It's like, no, you are the real you. Okay. So I'm happy to use the word soul to point to just you, the real you.
Yeah. So here we also have Professor, another letter. He says, that is really the crux of the matter. People are literally arguing that because machines have input and output commands, then they are conscious. I think he's referring to when we were discussing whether machines are conscious or not. Y4O says, if you know that you yourself exist, then you have conscious. I think it relates to the introspection thing.
Because even knowledge is itself something that takes place in consciousness. So the knowledge of my own existence implies my consciousness. I mean, it is really interesting to me. One of the surprises when I got into graduate school was the discovery of how many philosophers weren't just reductionists. They weren't reductionists. They were eliminativists. They questioned whether we even have actual consciousness. And I have a lot of respect for these philosophers, very much so. In fact, I think that they display a great courage in a way to take consciousness very seriously. Like it's the kind of thing that wouldn't arise from geometric reality. So if reality is fundamentally geometric, or maybe it's fundamentally something else that's not geometric, but it's incapable of generating consciousness, one solution to that problem of how you explain consciousness is to suppose that there is no consciousness, especially if you don't find it through empirical science of a brain. But then I think you do witness consciousness by knowing that you exist. And I love that comment there, because I think if you even know that you exist, I think that therefore consciousness exists. It's real.
Absolutely. Here we have Walid again saying, from where abrupt feelings of happiness, sorrow, pain, pleasure comes from in humans and would from within humans, I think he means. And would it be possible to indulge such feelings on robots by inputting certain commands and recreating it? I think we addressed that. So I don't think there is any model where a robot would be really having a first-person experience of a feeling.
I think that's right. Yeah, the robot wouldn't itself be the subject of the feeling merely by adding inputs, putting in commands. When I was younger, actually, I created this. Well, the computers in those days were older, obviously, and they were able to begin to have audio. And so I created this scenario where I would type in what the computer was saying. I brought my sister in and I pretended the computer was talking to her, and she didn't know because she was like 4 years old. And so I typed in things like, hello, I'm happy to see you. And she thought the computer was like literally, saying those things. She didn't know. But obviously by inputting those commands into the computer, I wasn't thereby giving it emotions and feelings. Function's not enough. Yeah.
Absolutely. We have here Ziba saying she posted a paper. It's YouTube. It just keeps killing links. Anyway, she says the paper says that a man got a heart transplant from a donor that took his own life. The recipient took his life the same way and also married the wife of the deceased man.
I understand what this is talking about. Did you want to say something about it? I have a few thoughts about this.
Of course, I think it relates to my proposition of the heart being the seat of the soul. I think that if you have a transplant of a limb, your emotions do not change. But I think there is something special about the heart being the seat of the soul, that there is a kind of imprint left on the material heart that when a transplant of the heart takes place, I think this carries with it some of the emotions of the other person. But of course, I would love to
Yeah, and
hear
I'm
what you
totally
have to
with
say.
you on that.
Yeah.
What I think this is pointing to is the way in which the sort of physical parts can act as devices for that interaction with the world, including devices for having certain experiences. So a metaphor would be like maybe I want to use a CD. I know CDs
Mm.
are now going obsolete, but you know, like you put a CD in a computer, and then like the computer can read the CD. Then you could take that CD and put it in a different computer, and the different computer can then read that same CD. And if you almost like think of a heart as a CD for emotions, okay, and affections, then you could take the CD out of one subject of consciousness, put it in a different subject of consciousness. You're not swapping the subjects of consciousness, you're swapping this sort of CD or this device for having certain emotions. And that would explain perhaps why, when there's that heart transplant, there's also a transplant of emotions.
Yeah.
You know, because you know, even if we're not fundamentally physical, we are integrated into a physical world. The physical world
Absolutely.
allows us to have that sort of interactive experience. So that's how I would answer that, explain that.
Yeah, pretty insightful indeed. Yeah, I agree with that too, totally. And here we have Ahmed Tawfiq. He says, a conscious AI will find itself alone and will immediately realize its situation would seek companion of its own kind that it can connect to. Yeah, so God gave Adam Eve the first day.
That's it.
He would have wanted him to be alone. But I think the conscious AI will have a problem finding the other one.
That's it. Yes, yes. Right. I
Yeah,
mean, unless the AI actually isn't fundamentally an AI, right? That's maybe the point, you know, that brings us full circle. It's like, well, in some sense, maybe I am a machine, but I'm not fundamentally a machine, right? I'm a subject of my experiences. Yeah.
absolutely. Walid says, can consciousness be transferred from one living person to another?
Well, maybe through transferring the sort of the CD-ROMs, right? Transferring parts of your brain, parts of your heart, where you're transferring certain maybe conscious capacities or experiences, but you're not transferring the subject. And I think maybe if
Subject.
there's a theme in this conversation, it really is distinguishing the subject or the bearer of consciousness, the self, and then the consciousness itself. So in
Absolutely.
some sense, yeah, I'm certainly open to the idea that we could sort of transfer consciousness to each other. I mean, there's a way in which right now, by communicating, we're facilitating a transfer of consciousness. You're giving me experiences, I'm giving you experiences. And so in that sense, I think so, for sure.
But we remain distinct persons. We're just transferring part of what we are in terms of our ideas or emotions or
That's it.
experiences. But yeah, we remain who we are. I think this is what
Yes.
you mean.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, yeah, we have Ahmed again saying consciousness, self-awareness, ability to make decisions. Are animals conscious? If they are, then a computer can be created behaving as cat, which is an animal. So, what do you think about animals? Do you think animals are conscious?
I do think an animal is conscious if it's alive. So, you know, the person asking the question is saying, well, maybe we could make an animal that's just a machine. But then I would ask, well, is that machine actually alive? I have a section about this in my book, which is about what makes something alive. And I
Hmm.
actually think that the demarcation between something that's alive and something that's just dead wood or whatever, dead sand blowing in the wind, is in terms of a subject of consciousness. And I take this all the way out to plants. So plants, it's not that they have thoughts and feelings in the way that we do, but if there's sunlight and the plant is moving towards the sunlight, if that plant is alive and that motion um, is itself a sign of its actual being alive, then I think that it has a kind of low grade consciousness, like a sense of warmth or some kind of positivity to go in this way versus that way, and that explains from top down or from plant as a whole down to its parts why its geometric parts do what they do in order to help it move towards survival. I think consciousness plays a role in life. So I do think that yes, animals, cats, and dogs, they do have real conscious capacities on my model.
Yeah, I believe so too, and I think there is actually a genuine distinction between animals and plants. But I think we'll have very hard time cracking it, really.
Well, and let me say, if there is that categorical distinction, then what I would want to say is that plants don't have life in the same way that animals do. And so, I can allow for that on my model as well. It's kind of an empirical question in a way, like how plants behave. But my model allows for consciousness to be in all the things that are genuinely able to, in a way, move their parts by their consciousness.
Yeah. Eventually, we have here, or finally, we have Ahmed Tafiq saying, "Great talk, loving it. Thank you, Ahmed." And I have a side note by Jamal saying that the guys in the cave were not Christians, but they were Jews because they were old in the Jewish tradition long before Jesus. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But at the end of the day, it's a side issue. Anyway, I think this was, Josh, this was really wonderful to me. And thank you very much for coming and for sharing your great research and great ideas and great, actually, you're so emotionally engaged in this. So thank you very much. I hope so many people will make benefit to it from it. And I ask everybody who has watched this to share it to those that he loves, and people who have doubts, and people who think that consciousness is manufactured, or that tomorrow we can have the robot that is a human being, and then we will have a problem with robot rights, etc. What are your thoughts about it, Josh?
I'm just totally with you. I mean, this has just been so much fun. I feel honored that I could be with you, and I just love our conversation. Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And to everybody who has been here with us, peace be upon you all. And please have some thinking about that. Think of yourself. Think that yourself takes you to your soul takes you to your creator, which takes you to your purpose. Let's have a good thought about that, and reflect it with our behavior also, and love each other, and find ourselves and find our destiny also. And once again, thanks a million, Josh, for being here. Please stay with me after we go offline. I'd like to thank you again. And for everybody, I'll be putting the extra now, and reminding you once more to share this and to like it, and to give me your comments in the comment section. We might have further discussion about it in writing too. So, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and peace be upon you all.